My wife didn't just cheat on me, she set out to wipe me off the map entirely. She wanted my kids, my money, and even my name, all while teaming up with a man I once trusted like a brother. But what they didn't realize was, the game they were playing. I'd invented the rulebook. And before this was over, they were going to understand exactly what that meant. You ever been betrayed so deeply it felt like the ground got ripped out from under you? The kind of betrayal that forces you to fight for every last thing that matters? If you have, you know what I'm talking about. Drop your story in the comments, you might remind somebody out there that integrity still counts for something. My name's Evan Cross. I'm 39. And this is how I turned the worst betrayal of my life into a battle for truth, justice, and my kids. I was sitting in the dim basement office that I'd built into my own little war room, the quiet hum of servers filling the air. One of my monitors was looping a high-def video I'd pulled from Sabrina's laptop, one she thought was locked up tight behind encryption. In the footage, she was sprawled across a velvet armchair inside some hotel suite that practically screamed money, laughing while Ryan Mercer, my so-called friend, poured champagne into her glass. Even without sound, I didn't need anyone to tell me what I was seeing. The way she leaned her head back. The way her hand lingered on Ryan's arm. The way he bent close and whispered something that made her smile like she'd already won the grand prize. On her wrist, a diamond bracelet caught the light, one I'd never bought her. And then I caught Ryan's lips forming the words, "A new life." I sat there staring at the screen, my face giving nothing away, but inside, 8 years of marriage had been reduced to a handful of pixels. Sabrina had always been driven, but this wasn't just ambition, this was cold-blooded planning. I switched the feed to another window, opening a folder I'd cracked just the night before. Every file inside was another nail in the coffin of the life I thought we'd built. The text messages between her and Ryan were written like business memos, calculated, deliberate. Ryan had typed, "The prenup won't matter if we can prove he's been using company resources for surveillance. Your mom's connections will guarantee you full custody." Sabrina's reply hit me harder than anything I'd braced myself for. "Caleb and Lily barely know him anyway. He chose work over family years ago. We'll make sure they understand that." I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. In my line of work, I'd been stabbed in the back before, clients lying, colleagues selling secrets. But this was personal. They weren't just sneaking around. They were rewriting my entire life, turning me into the villain in my own kids' eyes, erasing every sacrifice I'd made to keep them safe and cared for. Her words cut deeper than the video. She wasn't just walking away, she was dismantling me piece by piece, using the same ruthless precision she once used to land million-dollar real estate deals. I glanced around the office, really seeing my home for the first time. Upstairs, the brownstone was full of designer furniture she had picked out, art she had hung, rugs she insisted we import from Italy. None of it reflected me, the kid who'd bounced around foster homes, the man who'd built a business from the ground up, the guy who valued substance over show. Even the family photos on the walls had been staged by her, perfect snapshots that now felt completely hollow. It made me wonder, how much of our marriage had been real, and how much had been a performance, for the world, for Ryan, for her powerful family. I turned back to the monitor, my jaw tightening, not with blind rage, but with focus. Rage was for amateurs, for people who reacted without thinking. I'd built my entire career on never reacting, only acting with precision. If Sabrina and Ryan wanted to make this a game of strategy, they'd picked the wrong opponent. I shut down the monitor, letting the room fall into an even deeper silence. Then I reached into the locked drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were bank records, property deeds, and months of investigative notes, evidence I'd been gathering long before I ever confirmed the affair. My gut had told me something was off, and my gut had been right. Sabrina had trusted me with every detail of our finances. She never cared about the fine print, never questioned the papers I slid across the table. That trust, ironically the one thing she'd never doubted, was about to become the most expensive mistake she'd ever make. I laid the folder open on my desk. Clipped to the first page was a glossy photograph of Sabrina and Ryan at a charity gala months earlier, smiling for the cameras while plotting my downfall. For a few seconds, I let the weight of it all sink in, the loss of the woman I thought I knew, the knife in the back from a friend, the threat to my children's future. And then I buried it. This wasn't the time for feelings. This was the time to prepare, and preparation was what I did better than anyone. I closed the folder, my face hardening into the quiet determination that had made me one of the most respected security consultants in the city. Sabrina and Ryan had made their move. Now it was my turn. Back in 2013, before life became a minefield of distrust and half-truths, I was still trying to figure out how to live like a civilian. After 12 years in military intelligence, I'd traded covert missions for the more civilized, but no less intense, world of corporate security. That's when I met Sabrina Miles, a striking real estate developer who seemed to light up every room she stepped into. Our connection was quick, maybe even reckless. I'd never been the type to believe in love at first sight, but there was something about her confidence, her ambition, and the way she carried herself that pulled me right in. Within a year, we were married. Friends said I was moving too fast. My old military buddies warned me that anyone who rockets up the social ladder that quickly is usually fueled by something other than love. But back then, I didn't care. I thought I'd found someone who could see past the uniform, past the resume, straight to the man underneath. 3 years later, the twins were born, Caleb and Lily, two bright-eyed little reasons for me to work harder than I ever thought possible. For a while, it really did feel like we'd built the dream. Sabrina was climbing the social ladder with ease, I was locking in big contracts with high-profile clients, and together we were shaping the life we'd both pictured. What she never fully grasped was the cost of that dream. Corporate security consulting wasn't just boardroom PowerPoints and slick briefings. It meant middle-of-the-night phone calls, pulling stranded executives out of hostile countries, and tracking threats for corporations that thought they were untouchable. I carried it all without much complaining. Most nights ended with me in my home office, combing through surveillance reports while Sabrina was out at charity galas or business dinners. I told myself it was fine, she was growing her brand, and I was protecting ours. Every time I tucked Caleb and Lily into bed after a trip, I'd promise myself I'd be around more. But Sabrina loved the life my hours bought her, the dinners in members-only clubs, the invitations to private events, the quiet recognition in her social circle that she was married to someone who mattered. The first cracks didn't come with screaming matches or dramatic blow-ups. They came as whispers. Late-night phone calls she didn't explain. Conversations that died when I walked into the room. More business trips she took alone. At first, I ignored it. I was trained to spot patterns, but I wanted to believe she was still the same woman who squeezed my hand in the hospital when Caleb came too early and spent days in the NICU. But by 2019, the shift was impossible to miss. Her charm felt less like warmth and more like strategy. She spent more time with people I didn't know, wealthy investors, influential developers, men who seemed far more interested in her than whatever she was selling. At home, she turned colder, throwing digs at the hours I worked, as if forgetting those same hours paid for her perfectly curated world. I did what soldiers do, I fought quietly and steadily. More family dinners. More afternoons coaching Caleb's Little League team. More bedtime stories for Lily, even when I could barely keep my eyes open. But every effort felt like tossing pebbles into a hurricane. By the end of 2020, even my friends could see it. One night over drinks, an old army buddy finally got me to admit what I'd been avoiding. Something was wrong, and it was bigger than a rough patch. I didn't know it then, but Sabrina's ambition was about to cross a line I never imagined she'd step over. And the unraveling started on a quiet Sunday morning, with me alone in my office, digging through public records. If the military taught me anything, it's that patterns don't lie. Her sudden hostility, her family's growing interference, the smug confidence she carried around, it wasn't random. There was a bigger play, and I was finally ready to see it for what it was. The smoking gun was buried in sealed family court records, documents I got through a private source who still owed me a favor. As I scrolled through the scanned pages, my jaw tightened. The case went back 13 years, to an incident involving Sabrina's mother, Judge Margaret Voss. The official report said Margaret had dismissed a DUI charge against the son of a political donor, citing insufficient evidence. The sealed files told a different story. The driver wasn't some donor's kid, it was her own nephew. His reckless speeding had killed an immigrant family of 4. But Margaret's influence had buried the truth under layers of legal jargon and sealed testimony. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was career-defining corruption. Sabrina had always idolized her mother's power in the legal world. But now, I saw that power for what it was, a loaded gun. And if I aimed it right, it could change everything. I didn't stop there. For 2 solid weeks, I built the rest of the case in silence: financial records, campaign donations, photographs. Daniel Voss, Sabrina's father, wasn't just a bystander. The paper trail linked him to strategic contributions sent to the district attorney's re-election campaign just days after the case was buried. The Voss had spent decades polishing their image as champions of integrity and family values. Now, I held proof that image was a facade. I handled it like any other operation: no emotion, just precision. Every photo was time-stamped. Every transaction double-checked. Every document verified through independent records. Leverage that isn't airtight is useless, and this had to be bulletproof. By the time I finished, I had a file thick enough to end the Voss public life in a single news cycle. One call to the right journalist or federal investigator would detonate it all. But I wasn't reckless. I didn't want to torch Sabrina publicly, at least, not yet. This was about control, not chaos. So I waited, letting her and her attorney take the first swing. That moment came faster than I expected. A week later, I found myself across a polished conference table from Anthony Sharp, a smug, high-priced family lawyer with a reputation for arrogance. He slid a heavy packet of papers toward me, wearing the kind of smile only guys like him seem to perfect. "Sign these," he said, leaning back. "Sabrina will retain full custody of the twins. She'll also keep the house, the cars, and a majority of your consulting profits. It's in everyone's best interest to make this clean. Otherwise, we'll litigate aggressively, and I can assure you, Evan, you will lose." I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply picked up the stack, glanced over it like it was a grocery store flyer, and set it down again as if it wasn't even worth my time. The calm seemed to rattle him. He shifted in his chair, waiting for the anger that never came. Evan slid his hand into the leather portfolio resting beside him and pulled out a single envelope. He placed it on the table like it weighed nothing, yet the air seemed to grow heavier the moment it landed. His voice was steady, low, deliberate, each word spaced just enough to make sure it sank in. "Deliver this to your client." For the first time all meeting, Anthony's polished confidence cracked. His brow furrowed. "What is this?" "Just deliver it," Evan said, eyes locked on his. "And tell Sabrina to read it before she decides how far she really wants to push." Inside that envelope was a surgical strike, an organized summary of the Voss family's dirtiest secrets. Copies of the sealed court records. Financial transfers traced straight to Daniel. Photos of Margaret slipping into a private meeting with the district attorney just weeks before the fatal case disappeared. The message was simple: keep pushing, and the Voss wouldn't just lose the divorce, they'd lose the entire empire they'd spent decades polishing. Evan rose slowly, gathering his things without another word. The calm that filled the room wasn't peace, it was a warning. Anthony couldn't stop staring at that envelope, as if opening it might set off a bomb. As Evan walked out, his mind was clear. For the first time in months, the balance of power had flipped. Sabrina thought she'd caged him in, but now every move she made would have to account for the quiet storm he'd just set in motion. The first call came just after midnight. Evan was in his study, the house wrapped in silence except for the low hum of his laptop. Sabrina's name lit up the phone screen. He let it ring out. A minute later, Ryan Voss. Her brother. The family's self-appointed enforcer. That one went unanswered, too. 5 minutes later, the third call came. Margaret Voss. Evan answered. What do you want? She snapped, her voice sharp but carrying a thin edge of something she wasn't used to, unease. Margaret had built her career on intimidation, but now there was a tremor at the edges. Justice, Evan said evenly. Silence. Margaret inhaled slow, controlled, like she was buying herself time. You think you can threaten me with half-baked accusations? They're not accusations, Evan replied. They're records. Sealed court documents. Financial transfers. Photographs. You've spent years burying the Russo family under lies, but the truth is still there. You know it, and now so do I. Her voice lost some of its bite, softening in a way that almost sounded like pleading. What do you want, Evan? I want 3 things, he said without hesitation. Sabrina withdraws the divorce petition and signs over full custody of Caleb and Lily to me. Ryan sells his share of Bennett Security Solutions back to me, at the original valuation, not the inflated shakedown number he tried. And you resign from the bench quietly before the feds get to you first. He let the last sentence hang. Fail to do that, and the Russo family finally gets justice. I'll make sure every reporter in this city has what they need to burn you down. She tried one last card. You're bluffing. You already know I'm not. He hung up before she could answer. By morning, the cracks in the Voss armor were already visible. Evan hadn't called a single journalist directly, but an anonymous tip, complete with just enough detail to bait curiosity, had landed in the inboxes of 3 investigative reporters. A carefully redacted slice of the financial records had also made its way to a contact in the federal prosecutor's office. Not enough to prove the whole case, but enough to raise questions the Voss couldn't afford. Ryan broke first. By late afternoon, he'd left a furious voicemail, his voice cracking as he accused Evan of de-Evaning everything. An hour later, he called again, this time begging for a meeting. Evan didn't bother to reply. Sabrina's facade collapsed next. She showed up at his office without warning, her designer jacket wrinkled, her polished composure slipping. You're ruining us, she said, trying for anger but bleeding fear. Do you even care what this is doing to Caleb and Lily? Evan studied her for a long beat. I care more than anyone in your family ever has. That's why I'm doing it. By nightfall, the story was starting to grow legs. News outlets were hinting at a buried judicial scandal involving a respected judge. Online forums were buzzing about Voss family corruption. And for the first time in her career, Margaret skipped her scheduled court session. She knew Evan wasn't bluffing. And she knew the clock was ticking. The tension inside Anthony Sharp's office the next day was suffocating. Evan sat relaxed at the far end of the table, while Sabrina sat rigid across from him, both hands wrapped around a pen like it was the only thing holding her together. In front of her sat 3 documents: custody, business transfer, property settlement. Everything she'd fought for. Everything she thought she'd win. And she was about to sign it all away. Anthony, usually smug, looked pale, his eyes fixed on the table like he wanted to be anywhere else. Are we doing this or not? Evan asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Sabrina glared, but the fight in her eyes was gone. Her mother had gone silent after his ultimatum. Ryan hadn't even shown up. And the feds were already sniffing around the Voss finances. She lowered her gaze and began signing. Custody. Business. Property. Each stroke of her pen pulled another brick out of the empire she'd tried to build. When she slid the stack across the table, she muttered, "You win." Evan didn't touch them right away. He leaned forward, his expression unreadable. No, Sabrina. This isn't about winning. This is about truth. So before we wrap this up, you're going to say it, why you did all of this. She stared him down, lips pressed tight. Anthony shifted uncomfortably beside her, sensing the weight in the room. Evan said nothing, letting the silence do the work. Finally, Sabrina slammed the pen on the table. You want the truth? Fine. You were never good enough for me, she spat. I married you because you were useful, because you had money, connections, a name people respected. But underneath it all, you were just a security grunt pretending to be someone important. I outgrew you years ago. Evan listened without so much as a blink. When she was done, he gave a slow, almost thoughtful nod. And yet, he said evenly, I just took everything you valued. Color rose in her cheeks, but she said nothing. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. Evan gathered the signed documents and slid them into his leather folder. But before standing, he reached in again and placed another envelope on the table in front of her. What's this? She asked, her voice tight. Consider it a gift, Evan replied. She opened it, and froze. Inside were photographs. Ryan Voss, boarding a private jet with a woman half his age, their fingers intertwined. Another shot showed him withdrawing stacks of cash from a Cayman Islands account held in both his and Sabrina's names. The last image caught him stretched out on a yacht, champagne in hand, already celebrating his getaway. Her hand trembled as she flipped through them. This isn't real, she whispered, though her voice betrayed the crack in her certainty. It's real, Evan said. Ryan drained the accounts 2 days ago. By now, he's probably in Monaco. Whatever he promised you, it's gone. Just like everything else. Her composure shattered. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking, a muffled sob breaking the silence. Anthony shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at her. Evan didn't move. He simply stood, tucked the folder under his arm, and headed for the door. Without turning back, he left her with one last sentence. You wanted power, Sabrina. Now you have nothing left to fight for. He walked out, leaving her with the signed agreements and the weight of her own choices pressing down harder than anything he could have said. The public reckoning came faster than Evan expected. Within a week, Margaret Voss announced her resignation from the bench. The press release blamed health issues, but everyone knew the truth. The leaked court records were now part of an active federal inquiry, and whispers about the Russo family case were dominating local headlines. The Voss family's carefully crafted narrative of honor and public service unraveled in real time. Daniel Voss's hotel empire was the next to fall. Armed with Evan's evidence, investigators froze several of his accounts under suspicion of money laundering and campaign finance violations. Investors fled. Stock prices cratered. The Russo family, backed by a sharp team of civil attorneys, filed lawsuits that tied up nearly every Voss asset. Decades of power and prestige were crumbling under the weight of the truth, and Evan hadn't said a single word to the press. He didn't have to. The truth was doing the work for him. Sabrina's collapse was quieter, but no less final. The custody and business agreements left her boxed in financially. Ryan's theft of their shared accounts erased her safety net. Within months, she was selling off luxury cars and cashing in her remaining investments just to keep afloat. The exclusive invitations stopped coming. Old friends stopped returning calls. Eventually, she took a job as a mid-level real estate agent in a small suburban firm. No more galas, no penthouse listings, just open houses and commission checks. Once in a while, Evan heard about her through acquaintances. They said she was polite now, even humbled. But the pride was still there, in her posture, in her voice. The difference was, for the first time in years, she had no power to back it up. Ryan Voss wasn't given the luxury of fading away quietly. Through contacts from his military intelligence days, Evan passed investigators detailed files on Ryan's offshore accounts and his fraudulent business deals. Within weeks, Ryan's assets were frozen and his name landed on an international watch list. He hopped from country to country, each move shrinking his options. The woman he'd run away with left the moment his money dried up. By the time the media picked up the trail, Ryan was a fugitive, living under assumed names in short-term rentals, his reputation in ruins. Evan never celebrated. Late at night, sitting in his home office, he sometimes thought about how easy it would have been to let anger drive everything, to crush them just for revenge. But that was never the mission. This was about balance. Consequences. Making sure those who deadened others for their own gain were finally stripped of the protection their lies had bought them. The Voss had built their empire on deception. Now, the collapse was complete. For Evan, justice wasn't loud. It was precise. Methodical. Final. And for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. 3 months later, life felt different. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Evan stood on his porch, leaning against the wooden railing, watching Caleb and Lily race across the backyard. Their laughter rang out, pure, unburdened, the kind of sound he hadn't heard in far too long. They didn't know the full story. They didn't understand the legal battles, the threats, the quiet war he'd fought to protect them. All they knew was their father had fought for them, and that was enough. Caleb stopped to catch his breath, cheeks flushed from running. Lily squealed, darting toward the swings. Evan smiled, pride settling in his chest. This was why he'd endured the sleepless nights. Why he'd chosen patience over rage. Why he'd played the long game. Not for revenge. For this. This simple, peaceful moment. Life had shifted in other ways, too. Cross Security, the company Evan had built long before the Voss tried to rip it away, was thriving again. Word of the Voss scandal had rippled through the corporate world, and the same clients who once hesitated to sign with him were now lining up. His reputation, already solid, was now ironclad. He'd expanded operations, bringing in a small team of trusted former colleagues. Work was steady enough that he was turning down contracts instead of chasing them. But he didn't live in his office anymore. The late nights spent glued to security feeds had been replaced by family dinners, helping with school projects, and evenings in the yard teaching Caleb how to throw a curveball. Somewhere along the way, he'd learned how to let go of the anger. Sure, he could have pushed further, burned down the last shreds of the Voss influence until there was nothing left but ash. But there was no point. Margaret was disgraced. Daniel's empire was under a microscope. Ryan was still on the run. And Sabrina, she wasn't a threat anymore. She was just another person trying to pick up pieces from a life she'd deadened herself. In his office, only one photograph of her remained, a shot from years ago, back when they'd still called themselves a family. He didn't keep it out of love, or longing. He kept it as a reminder. Trust, he'd learned, wasn't something you hand out freely. It had to be earned, guarded, and never taken for granted. As the sun slid lower on the horizon, Evan stepped off the porch and crossed the yard. Caleb tossed him the baseball, and Lily clapped when he caught it without breaking stride. For the first time in years, the ground under his feet felt steady. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his. And he'd earned every inch of it through patience, sacrifice, and a quiet, unshakable determination to protect what mattered most. Some betrayals will try to take everything from you, but sometimes, they leave you with exactly what you need.